A single narrow mountain pass in Southern California may be the only thing standing between the region and an earthquake far worse than the big one most people already fear. And a new peer-reviewed study has just revealed that the stress sitting beneath it has reached a level not seen in 1,000 years. So let's get right into exactly what this research found and why scientists are calling this pass a gate. Let's start with the actual research, because this comes from a genuinely rigorous, peer-reviewed source rather than speculation. A study published in June of this year in the Journal of Geophysical Research Solid Earth, led by Dr. Lillian Burkhardt of the University of Bern, alongside colleagues from Northern Arizona University, the United States Geological Survey, and the University of California, San Diego, modeled a full 1,000 years of earthquake activity along the southern San Andreas and Centauro Jacinto faults. The research gained widespread public attention on August 2nd of this year, when ABC7 in Los Angeles aired a detailed segment on the findings, featuring both Dr. Burkhardt and Dr. Lucy Jones, the Caltech seismologist who helped develop the benchmark earthquake simulation long used for Southern California emergency planning. Here's the headline finding driving all of this attention. Tectonic stress on two of Southern California's most dangerous fault systems, the Southern San Andreas and the San Jacinto, has reached its highest level in 1,000 years. And according to the research, current conditions actually favor the kind of joint two-fault rupture that scientists say would be considerably more destructive than the single-fault big one scenario most Californians have already spent years bracing for. Let's talk about the detail that most existing coverage has genuinely understated, because it is arguably the most important piece of this entire study. The San Jacinto fault runs parallel to the San Andreas a short distance away, and the two systems come remarkably close to each other at a specific location called Cajun Pass, a narrow mountain gap that also happens to carry Interstate 15, a major transportation corridor connecting Los Angeles, the Inland Empire, and the Coachella Valley. According to Dr. Burkhardt, in terms of severity, a joint rupture crossing Cajun Pass could approach magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 and affect a far larger area than a single fault event would on its own. To reach this conclusion, the research team reconstructed a full 1,000 years of seismic activity along both faults, carefully tracking how stress has accumulated and released over that entire span, allowing them to identify exactly what conditions have historically determined whether an earthquake rupture stays confined to one single fault or manages to jump across and trigger a connected rupture on the neighboring fault as well. This is precisely why researchers and science communicators covering this story have started referring to Cajun Pass as a kind of earthquake gate, a specific geographically narrow location that can either contain a rupture to one fault or allow it to pass through, and combine into something considerably larger. Depending on the exact stress conditions present at the moment, an earthquake actually occurs there. It is worth explaining clearly why a joint two-fault rupture would be so much more dangerous than a single-fault earthquake of similar or even somewhat lower individual magnitude. When an earthquake ruptures along a single fault, the energy release and resulting ground shaking, while still potentially catastrophic, follows a pattern scientists have modeled extensively using both historical earthquakes and detailed computer simulations. A joint rupture crossing between two separate fault systems releases energy across a considerably longer combined rupture. Length generates stronger and more prolonged shaking across a wider geographic footprint, and critically affects multiple separate population corridors simultaneously, rather than concentrating damage along one single, more predictable fault trace. According to Dr. Burkhardt's assessment, this specific scenario could devastate the Interstate 15 corridor, along with the water supply infrastructure, serving Los Angeles, the Inland Empire, and the Coachella Valley all at once, a combination of transportation and water infrastructure failure that emergency planners consider especially dangerous, given how interconnected the region's recovery capabilities depend on both systems remaining functional simultaneously. Let's talk about why Dr. Lucy Jones's involvement in reviewing and discussing these findings carries so much weight within the seismology community specifically. Jones has spent decades working directly with the United States Geological Survey and Caltech on Southern California earthquake risk, and she was instrumental in developing the shakeout earthquake scenario, the detailed, widely referenced simulation that emergency planners across Southern California have used for years to prepare for a major San Andreas rupture. Her willingness to engage seriously with this newer research on joint fault rupture risk, rather than dismissing it, signals that the broader seismology community views this specific finding as a genuine, credible addition to existing earthquake hazard models, not simply an attention-grabbing headline detached from established science. Now let's address directly what this research does and does not tell us about timing, since that distinction matters enormously for understanding the actual practical risk here. The study establishes that stress along these two fault systems has reached a historically unprecedented level, and that current conditions favor the physical possibility of a joint rupture occurring. It does not and cannot tell us exactly when such a rupture might actually happen. Reliable short-term earthquake prediction, specifying an exact date or even a narrow window of years for any specific earthquake, remains beyond the capability of modern seismology, regardless of how sophisticated stress modeling techniques have become. What this research does provide is a meaningfully improved understanding of the specific mechanism and conditions that would need to align for a joint rupture to occur, along with clear evidence that those underlying stress conditions are currently more favorable for exactly that scenario than they have been at any point across the entire 1,000-year record the researchers examined. It is worth placing this finding within the broader, already well-established context of Southern California earthquake risk, since this new research adds a specific, more dangerous wrinkle to a hazard picture scientists have been tracking for decades. The southern San Andreas Fault, specifically, has not experienced a major rupture since sometime between 1680 and 1690, meaning this section of the fault has now gone considerably longer without releasing accumulated strain than its historical average recurrence interval of roughly 200 years would suggest, a detail seismologists have long described using the word overdue. The broader statewide earthquake forecast, developed by the United States Geological Survey and the Southern California Earthquake Center, has for years placed California's overall probability of experiencing a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake within any 30-year window at greater than 99%, with the odds running slightly higher in Southern California, specifically compared with the northern part of the state. This new Cajun Pass research does not replace or contradict that existing risk assessment. It sharpens it by identifying a specific mechanism through which an already anticipated major earthquake could become considerably more destructive than previously modeled scenarios accounted for. This research also connects to a broader pattern of new findings emerging about California's fault systems over just the past year, suggesting the scientific community's understanding of these risks continues actively evolving, rather than remaining static. Separate research published earlier this year has been tracking swarms of extremely small, often imperceptible earthquakes beneath Northern California, revealing a hidden and surprisingly complex fault system at the exact location where the San Andreas Fault meets the Cascadia subduction zone, and another entirely separate study examining sediment layers preserved from ancient underwater landslides off the coast of Oregon found evidence suggesting a major Cascadia earthquake could potentially trigger a second, separate earthquake on the San Andreas Fault within a remarkably short window of time, raising the possibility of an even larger coast-wide earthquake sequence extending well beyond Southern California alone. Taken together, this growing body of research reflects a broader scientific shift toward understanding California's major faults as a genuinely interconnected system, where stress and rupture on one fault can meaningfully influence the behavior of neighboring faults, rather than treating each fault as an entirely independent hazard, to be assessed in isolation. So what should someone living in or traveling through the affected region, particularly the Interstate 15 corridor connecting Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley, actually do with this information? According to guidance connected to this research, there are concrete, genuinely useful steps worth taking, and importantly, one of the most valuable costs, nothing at all. Familiarize yourself with the Shake Alert early warning system already active across California, which can provide a genuinely useful few seconds to tens of seconds of advance warning before strong shaking actually arrives at your specific location. Precisely the kind of warning window that can make a meaningful difference for taking cover, or for automated systems that can slow trains, open firehouse doors, or pause certain industrial processes automatically. Know your specific evacuation routes if you live or work anywhere near Cajun Pass or the broader Interstate 15 corridor, and consider that a major earthquake in this specific area could simultaneously disrupt the primary transportation route connecting several major population centers at once. Keeping a stocked emergency kit with water, food, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio, since power, water, and cellular networks are often among the first services disrupted after a significant earthquake, a concern this research specifically flags given the water supply infrastructure running through the affected corridor. And if you are simply traveling through the region rather than living there permanently, understand your hotel or accommodation's specific earthquake procedures and keep basic supplies accessible during your stay, since visitors are often less familiar with regional evacuation routes and emergency protocols than long-term residents. It is also worth understanding why this kind of long-term, historically grounded stress modeling represents such a valuable advance for earthquake science more broadly, beyond just this one specific finding about Cajun Pass. Reconstructing a full 1,000 years of Earthquake activity along two separate fault systems requires piecing together multiple different lines of geological evidence, including paleoseismic trenching that physically exposes and dates layers of disturbed soil left behind by ancient earthquakes, combined with careful statistical modeling that accounts for the inherent uncertainty and dating techniques stretching back many centuries. This kind of painstaking multidisciplinary reconstruction work is precisely what allows researchers to identify genuinely rare, historically unprecedented conditions, like this current stress level reaching its highest point across the entire 1,000-year record, rather than simply relying on the comparatively short instrumental earthquake record available since modern seismographs were first installed roughly a century ago. A time span far too brief to reliably capture the full range of behavior these major, slow-moving fault systems are actually capable of producing. It helps to understand a bit more about the specific mechanics of how a rupture can actually jump from one fault to another, since that process is genuinely more complicated than simply one earthquake causing a second, separate earthquake nearby. When a major earthquake ruptures along a fault, the rupture itself propagates as a traveling wave, tearing through the crust at speeds that can approach several kilometers per second. Whether that traveling rupture stays confined to the fault it started on or manages to jump across to a nearby geometrically connected fault depends heavily on the specific geometry of how the two fault surfaces relate to each other at their closest point of approach, along with the stress conditions already present on that neighboring fault at the exact moment the rupture arrives. At Cajun Pass, specifically, the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults come close enough together and their surrounding geometry is favorable enough that researchers have identified this location as a genuine candidate for exactly this kind of rupture jumping behavior, provided stress on the San Jacinto side is already elevated enough to essentially be primed and waiting for that additional push. This new research's core finding, that stress has now reached a 1,000-year high, is precisely what shifts this scenario from a theoretical possibility into something researchers consider genuinely favored under current conditions. It is also worth comparing this joint rupture scenario against the more familiar single fault big one scenario most Southern California residents have already spent years learning to prepare for, since understanding the difference in scale helps explain why this new research has generated so much attention among seismologists specifically. The benchmark shakeout scenario that Dr. Lucy Jones helped develop years ago modeled a magnitude 7.8 rupture along the southern San Andreas fault alone, producing an estimated 2 full minutes of continuous shaking across the region, an almost unimaginable duration compared with the handful of seconds most people associate with even a significant earthquake. A joint rupture crossing through Cajun Pass and combining both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems would fall within a similar overall magnitude range, but critically, it would distribute that shaking and the resulting damage across a meaningfully wider geographic footprint, since two separate fault traces running through two somewhat different population corridors would both be actively rupturing rather than just one. That distinction, wider geographic impact rather than simply a higher magnitude number, is really the core reason researchers describe this joint rupture scenario as potentially more destructive than the already devastating single fault big one scenario emergency planners have used for years. There's also a practical infrastructure dimension to this specific research worth understanding in more depth, since Cajun Pass carries considerably more than just Interstate 15 through its narrow geography. This same mountain gap also carries critical rail lines connecting Southern California to the rest of the country, along with major aqueduct and pipeline infrastructure that plays a direct role in supplying water to the densely populated communities on either side of the pass. A joint rupture concentrated specifically at this location carries the potential to simultaneously damage transportation, rail, and water infrastructure, all running through the same narrow geographic corridor. Precisely the kind of concentrated, multi-system infrastructure failure that emergency planners consider especially difficult to recover from quickly, since redundant routes and backup systems become considerably harder to activate when the damage is concentrated in one specific geographic choke point rather than spread more diffusely across a wider region. Let's bring this all together. A peer-reviewed study published this June has found that tectonic stress along Southern California's San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems has reached its highest level in 1,000 years, and that current conditions specifically favor the kind of joint, two fault rupture crossing through Cajun Pass that could produce an earthquake in the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range, considerably more destructive and far-reaching than a single fault rupture alone. This research, led by Dr. Lillian Burkhardt and reviewed publicly by Caltech seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones, identifies Cajun Pass specifically as a kind of earthquake gate, a narrow geographic location capable of either containing a rupture to one single fault or allowing it to combine into a considerably larger coast-wide event, depending on the exact stress conditions present when an earthquake eventually strikes there. While this research cannot tell us exactly when such an earthquake might occur, since reliable short-term earthquake prediction remains beyond current scientific capability, it does provide a meaningfully sharper understanding of a specific, historically unprecedented risk facing the densely populated corridor connecting Los Angeles, the Inland Empire, and the Coachella Valley, adding real urgency to existing earthquake preparedness efforts across the entire region. I will keep tracking this research closely, along with any related studies examining California's interconnected fault systems. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on for whenever there is meaningful new research on this topic. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. A single narrow mountain pass may be doing more to determine Southern California's earthquake future than almost anyone realized until this research came out, and scientists are watching it more closely now than ever before. I will see you in the next one.